have spent the first couple of months talking about how great the common law is. What we're going to be talking about today are some failings of the common law. The common law is not perfect. I mentioned in the first class that there's sometimes you'll need a little bit of legislation. We're going to get into the specifics of what errors the common law is prone to. Common law failings. Number one, judges pretend that they know more than they do. This manifests itself in a lot of different ways. A brick maker is next door to a residence. The person in the residence takes up a court case against the brick maker. Says that the fumes from the brick making are noxious, making me sick, making my house inhospitable. They take it to court. During trial, the judge, or I guess this is after trial, it comes time to the judgment. It's a jury trial. The judge instructs the jury, hey, you gotta make, not every complaint, even if it's valid, is worth the cost to the public, the greater good. Please keep the greater good in mind. And what happened is, the jury said, okay, there was no nuisance because brick making is important, so we should allow this brick maker to work, then this is a problem. This is not a problem, right? The brick maker was allowed to continue emitting noxious fumes, upsetting their neighbor. The judge said this is okay. This is totally okay because we're doing this for the public good. This was before governments got the idea of making decisions based on the public good. Judges can come up with this public good idea themselves. They come up with a Latin word for it, pro bono publica, literally for the public good. What ended up happening in that specific case is that the homeowner appealed that decision and took it to the House of Lords. This was in England. The House of Lords was sort of like the Supreme Court at the time in England. And the House of Lords said, no, this was a big mistake. We're going to overrule this decision because they said this is in effect legalizing nuisances. We don't want to legalize nuisances. So in that particular instance, the House of Lords overturned a decision by a judge. You guys know how the House of Lords works in England? You're appointed for life on the king or queen appoints you for life on the advice of the prime minister. A bunch of unelected bureaucrats overturned a law arrived at through the common law system because they thought the cost would be too high. Another example, you have Sudbury. Sudbury is a town up north in Ontario. A lot of nickel mining goes on there. And the land famously was very desolate, so desolate that there's a story that when NASA wanted to train their astronauts about how to deal with the harsh lunar terrain when they were sending their astronauts up to the moon, they sent them to Sudbury to train because it was the most moon-like place on Earth. It's not clear whether that's totally true, but it had that reputation of being a really crappy area. Some people tried to sue the nickel smelters and said, hey, all this nickel smelting is ruining our land, it's ruining our crops. This isn't fair. The judges came back and said, no, we're going to rule in favor of the nickel smelters because this is the character of the neighborhood. This is the character of Sudbury. Sudbury is a mining area. We're going to have bad mining air and lands, and that's your problem. If you have a problem, leave. The character of the neighborhood, preserving that comes up a lot in land use rules as well. So I've talked about Toronto land use planning. How land use planning and zoning, etc. works is that there's the zoning bylaw, which is the specific codes about what you can do in this specific plot of land. Those are supposed to be in congruity with something called the official plan. Every city has an official plan where they lay out what kind of neighborhood that they want, what kind of city that they want. And in the city of Toronto, their official plan says any new development, regardless of what the zoning actually says, any new development has to keep with the character, the physical character of the neighborhood. What this actually means is that in some parts of the city where the zoning bylaw allows for townhouses or semi-detached homes even, and someone wants to turn their property into a semi-detached house, people will complain and say, hey, this isn't keeping with the character of the neighborhood because the character of the neighborhood is only detached houses. And if you build a semi-detached or a townhouse, then this is destroying the character of our neighborhood. The problem there is, who determines what the character of the neighborhood is? Who determines what character is? It's a vague term. It's used now in legislation. It evolves through the common law as well. The second problem is something called bias. Judges, like the rest of us, are human beings. They have emotions, they have biases. A couple of economists a few years ago looked at juvenile judge cases from 1996 to 2012. And they also looked at football results during that same period of time. Why would they do that? Because they had a theory that if there was an unexpected win or loss by a football team, and a judge was a follower of that football team, then the judge's emotions would be affected, and the judge would be basing their decisions based on their emotions, and then that would play out in their cases. We talked about evaluating policy last week. What kind of policy evaluation tool is that? So you're trying to figure out how judges' biases are affecting outcomes, and then you're using this football outcomes, football games, as a way of measuring bias. What kind of policy evaluation tool is that? Any ideas? Yeah?
Instrumental variable?
That's an instrumental variable. What do you think they found? They found that the judges, when their football team loses unexpectedly, they were in such a bad mood that they gave harsher sentences to the juveniles that they were adjudicating over. They gave especially harsher sentences to black juveniles. Their football team loses, and then something goes on in their mind that says, I gotta punish these black teenagers more than I normally would. That's not good justice. But that's a real problem. There are all sorts of other prejudices judges have. Another famous instance is awarding custody. Women are disproportionately awarded custody in divorce cases than men, even when controlling for income differences, mental health differences, etc. Judges still have a notion that women should get the children more than men. People argue that this isn't in line with justice if we're trying to take the best interests of the child. There's some other arbitrariness. Civil cases are supposed to be decided by a standard called the preponderance of evidence. Preponderance of evidence. Have you guys heard of the preponderance of evidence standard? No? Preponderance of evidence means that which side seems to have more evidence in their favor. People try to quantify this and say, whichever side seems to have a 51% chance of being right or greater. That's a preponderance of evidence. In criminal justice, the standard there is beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond a reasonable doubt. The problem there is, who's to say what is reasonable? How do you measure, how do you weigh out different evidences? In what objective way can you do this? The answer is you can't. So there are always going to be cases on the margin when it comes to preponderance of evidence where the judge basically flips a coin. But even when you increase the standard to beyond a reasonable doubt, that's the highest legal standard possible. Judges still make mistakes. You've heard of, probably haven't heard the name, but there's something called the Innocence Project. Anyone heard of the Innocence Project? Oh, good. The Innocence Project, for those of you who haven't heard, is that where lawyers are trying to use DNA evidence to overturn death sentences or life convictions. Mostly death sentences of people who were wrongly convicted of the highest crimes. But now with new DNA evidence, they've been exonerated of any crime. Even when, so this situation was so serious that there was a time in the 90s when Canada was no longer sending criminals back to the United States. They're not extraditing criminals back to the United States when they faced capital punishment, because they didn't trust the system to deal fairly with capital punishment. Capital punishment is supposed to have the highest standard of evidence, and it was proved to be so unreliable prior to the existence of cheap availability of DNA evidence that the government of Canada wasn't sending people suspected of murder across the border. But here's the thing about this. If the courts were making such a big mistake when the stakes were so high, what are the odds that they were making just as many or fewer mistakes when the stakes were much lower under a preponderance of evidence standard? Does that make sense? when judges have to decide who gets to live and die, they're making so many mistakes that there's this whole Innocence Project thing where hundreds of people have been saved because they were wrongly convicted. What about the tens of thousands of other people who've been convicted based on much lower burdens of evidence? People complain about the court of public opinion judging too quickly. Normal courts are run by people. They're liable to make the same mistakes. Questions about this so far?
Over here.
Yeah.
Why is this a failing of the common law? Is common, you get convicted for life sentences or death in the common law? Is that much for the common law?
So there's common law and there's customary law. So you can have, in the English common law, the Anglo-Saxon common law, you can't get sentenced to death for civil cases. That's been taken over by the criminal law. But there are other countries, and in history, before we had the rise of criminal law, murder was a common law case. And judges were making the same decisions there. It was deemed that it was too important to leave to the common law, and now that's been taken over by legislation. But historically, it wasn't like that. It wasn't always like that. Any other questions? We're going to focus a bit more. I'm going to change topics a little bit. But when judges pretend to know what they're doing, they do something called cost-benefit analysis. I've heard about cost-benefit analysis, and I talked about this last week, where they'll bring in economists even to help with the cost-benefit analysis. Well, one thing we learned was that costs are subjective, benefits are also subjective. So doing an objective cost-benefit analysis is a chimera, is a make-believe goal. Instead, well, there's another problem there too, because beyond the subjectivity issue, you guys have been reading Coase this week, and Coase talks about something called transaction costs. Judges like to also calculate transaction costs as part of their cost-benefit analysis. But we know that transaction costs are subjective. But what does Coase say about living in a world without transaction costs when it comes to property rights? Well, let's first define what transaction costs are. What are transaction costs? Yes?
The costs involved with making a deal?
The costs involved in making a deal, making a transaction, right? You're making an exchange. It could be either with yourself, or most of the time it's with someone else. There are negotiation costs, there are distance costs, communication costs, all these other things that make it difficult to make a transaction. But if we lived in a world where there were no transactions, but we still had property, what would that world look like? Yes?
He basically argued that you wouldn't need a legal system because the decision the two parties would make together on their own would be maximizing like the fairness or solving the problem.
Yeah. In a world without transaction costs, you wouldn't need courts. In a world without transaction costs, you wouldn't need law. If we just had ownership of the physical thing as the only ownership standard, not legal ownership, just physical possession. In a world without transaction costs, you wouldn't need legal definitions of ownership. You wouldn't need justices. You wouldn't even need insurance. Why? Why wouldn't you need judges if there were no transaction costs? Why wouldn't you need judges? Yeah.
Since you just negotiate between the two people, or against yourself.
Yeah.
And you would need a third party.
There's a railroad going next to some farmland, and there are sparks flying from the railroad whenever the train goes by, and those sparks land on the farmland and set it on fire. Who has imposed the cost on who in that situation? Who has imposed the cost on who? The train is going, it's emitting sparks, and then the crops nearby are catching on fire. Who's imposed the cost on who? Yes? The train has imposed costs on the crops. Anyone disagree? Why doesn't the farmers, why aren't they imposing a cost on the train person? Yeah.
I think it's because they're experiencing a loss on the train. It's just going on the way it usually does when they're coming on and compared to it.
Well, if the farmers sued the train company and they required the train to put on some spark prohibiting device, that's a cost to the train company too, right?
But is this in the middle, like where the transaction cost equals zero and there's no law, just negotiate with each other? Is this in the middle?
So this is where we're trying to get here. If there were, in this situation that I just described, the train is emitting sparks and the crops are catching on fire and the farmers want the train to stop emitting sparks, they're both trying to impose costs on each other. It takes two to tango, and people impose costs on each other all the time. The train is imposing costs on the farmers, and the farmers are trying to impose costs on the train. Who's right? If they could trade without transaction costs, they could either come to an agreement where the farmers move their crops back further away from where the sparks are flying, or where the train company would have to put spark protectors. But we don't live in that world where we don't have transaction costs. So what have we invented instead? We invented, or we distinguished between legal property and economic ownership. And then when you have this distinction, you now have created a reason to create a justice system, to assess legal liability, not just economic. Questions on that? Yes?
What's the difference between legal property and economic ownership?
Economic ownership is physical, is mere physical possession. I just have this pen. I have this calculator. Economically, I own this calculator. Legally, you own this calculator. Coase is saying, if there are no transaction costs, and I can just walk up and grab stuff willy-nilly, people will exchange their property rights and create fences and other barriers in such a way where that won't happen anymore. Any other questions? Coase isn't just saying that though. That idea that in a free market, totally free market, people will exchange property and it will go to the person who values it the most. That idea is much older than Coase. That's not what Coase is known for. Coase's idea is that because we have ownership, legal ownership, because we have transaction costs, then we can't simply, we gotta figure out other ways of distributing resources. We need a legal system, and the legal system has to recognize legal property rights. And how should we organize our legal property rights? Lots of people have misunderstood costs and have tried to figure out. They take a case to court, and the judge tries to figure out if there was a world without transaction costs, who would truly own this resource? And that's when they'll bring in the economists and the other accountants to figure things out. The alternative standard is who owned the property and who's trespassing. Who's trespassing and who's causing a nuisance? We've developed a legal system so that we don't have to imagine what the costs are. The cases for trespass are obvious. You have a line, you have a fence, or you're inside my fence or out. That's much easier to calculate than what were the economic benefits or the economic costs in a world without transaction costs. But judges have been misguided by the numbers, by the math, by the graphs, and they say, oh, let's pretend to calculate total economic costs, when it's much easier to see who stepped foot on whose property first. Yes?
Is there any instance where looking at it from that sort of point of view, like nuisance and trespass would not be the right way to come at a case? Or would that always be like the best way to look at it?
So there's no best. The classical liberal and libertarian view likes that view of nuisance and trespass as the only standard. There are, of course, the pragmatists. There are, of course, the utilitarians who say that let's figure out whatever would make the most number of people happy. Any other questions? Any other questions on transaction costs, on costs? Some of you have your lab on costs after this. Firms, businesses. Would firms exist in a world without transaction costs? Why?
Because there wouldn't be any need to lower the transaction costs with the middleman.
The whole point of business is to lower transaction costs. Every business is trying to lower transaction costs somehow. An iPhone is lowering your transaction cost of looking things up on Instagram or learning about things through Wikipedia or talking to your grandparents. Middlemen, all these online mattress companies are coming around saying we're cutting out the middlemen. Middlemen serve a purpose. And their purpose is to cut down transaction costs. You're over here in Guelph and you would like a mattress. There are mattress makers in, I don't know where they have mattresses, where they make mattresses. In, let's say, Kansas. How does the Kansas person know where to find you? Know that you personally need a mattress. There are wholesalers who buy mattresses from others, and they set up shop in Guelph and online, and they try to bring you and the mattress manufacturers together. Middlemen are great. They lower transaction costs. Yes?
So the businesses that buy from the wholesaler, the middlemen, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone who's in between the consumer and the producer is a middleman. And the middleman system here is very extensive. The richer a society is, the more middlemen it necessarily creates. It has to create more middlemen. By cutting out middlemen, you're making yourself poorer. Cutting out middlemen is a bad idea economically. unless you found a way to reduce transaction costs even more. The job of the middleman is to find buyers that the producer can't afford to search for on his own. Any other questions? Yes?
There's like Costco, I think, comes out like a couple middlemen to like cut down their costs. Would that be like,
They cut down costs in bulk,
oh,
and they also require you to buy membership. Not everybody needs 40 rolls of toilet paper at once. Yeah.
So, sorry, you're saying it's cheaper for a consumer to go through the middleman than
Yes.
the straight?
Yes. Middlemen make things cheaper. Middlemen make things cheaper. Yeah.
But like, I thought the whole point was like, each step along the way increases, like each of those businesses wants to make a profit.
Yeah.
The price will increase of the item.
That's what they do. But remember what we drew early in the semester. We got consumers. We got producers. Which way, who drives value? Which way does value flow? From producers to consumers or consumers to producers? Consumers to producers. Value goes up this way. The consumers are willing to pay a price, willing and able to pay a price. The producers have to find the consumers first, though. So the middleman, one guy here, middleman 1, number 1, he knows this consumer, and he tries to make a deal with the producer, but he doesn't know any producers. So that creates a business for middleman number 2. He says, hey, middleman number 2, go find me a producer. Middleman number 2 knows several producers. He's a wholesaler. This guy buys from this wholesaler at a retail price, and then he sells it to the consumer. Yes?
So is like companies that are going maybe more like online or like just going by like ordering maybe in less stores, is like just online ordering kind of like where a lot of people are cutting out like the middlemen?
Online ordering, people are trying to cut out the middleman because they figured out cheaper ways of finding consumers. But you all know that a lot of these online companies are actually losing money. Like Casper is losing a ton of money. It's very uneconomical. Cutting out middlemen is very uneconomical. So they're selling you things for cheap, but they're losing money in the process. That's not sustainable. Yes?
But also, do we have a lot of like online retailers that distribute like as the middlemen, like they're
Yeah.
taking from factories and they're just like an online presence as a middleman, they're not like a physical store?
That's exactly it. Right? So they figured out that by advertising on Facebook and Instagram, that they can find a lot of customers. They can find customers better than those factories in China. So they invented, this has been around for a long time, drop shipping, where a factory in China produces a bunch of toothbrushes, but they don't know anyone in North America who wants a toothbrush. So there are people in North America who know how to use Facebook and advertise to people who want toothbrushes. Yes?
What about companies like Apple, which partly own their own stores, but then also sell to middlemen like Best Buy and Walmart?
Yeah. So they can only afford to build so many stores. There are a lot more customers than they have opportunities to build stores. If they build their own stores, that's going to take time, first of all. They got to pay rent. They got to pay health insurance to their workers. It's kind of easier for them to find Best Buy to deal with that problem, because they can still make sense in some cases. Some cases it makes sense, other cases it doesn't. Yes?
if a company finds that their prices are getting too high and consumers are less willing to buy, would they then cut out a middleman or would they do something else?
They're just going to try to lower transaction costs. Middlemen are one kind of transaction cost. There are other kinds of middlemen too. Within a factory, there are middlemen. They might try to cut out some of their own workers. Any other questions? Transaction cost is basically the whole reason we have an economy. Everything is a transaction cost. Any other questions? No? All right, then I'll see you guys on Friday.